and welcome to the last week of Principles of Health and Wellness. So, we're going to drop in and finish up this class with a couple different chapters. First one's going to be stress assessment and management technique, and this is going to relate to information that we're going to be looking deeper into when we get into sports psychology. All right, so we want to make sure that we're paying attention to all of that because ultimately, what's going to happen is it'll be a good segue into that because in 2 months we'll be able to get into that. So it'll be a good refresher when it comes around again. So let's start off with just kind of that little intro piece here. So talking about how stress management, stress assessment, how to take care of basically what we're talking about is emotional wellness, emotional well-being, and really how that emotional piece does make up one of the components for total wellness, total overall wellness, but really how emotions can really mess with our immune system, either positively or negatively, and it can create either illness or disease, and how we're more susceptible and more prone to be that way based on how emotional we can become. All right, so first and foremost, there is that link. All right, we know that there's this link between mind and body. All right, we know that when you react a certain way emotionally, it triggers and sets off a cascade of events that will release specific hormones depending upon what you're doing. Okay, whether it's a fight or flight response or more of a response that's more low key, more trying to be below homeostasis. All right, so hormones also are that tie-in to where it's that emotion. Hormones are emotionally respondent to the effects that it has on health. Okay, so we're definitely looking at it from that perspective as well. So really, what are we saying is that the brain and the immune system are really synchronous, and they work together very well. They're connected very well, so that as you become more adapted to healthier patterns, you're less susceptible and more resistant to any disease, meaning that you don't want to have disease infiltrate your body, obviously. But what we're saying is that if the brain and the immune system are in proper working order, they're working together, there's a good health, there's a good level of stress, both good and bad stress, because you're going to have both, that disease will not present itself in as much of a fashion, right? So ultimately, we know that the brain itself, this is what it does, all right? It directs nerve impulses to create responses throughout the body. It controls both involuntary and voluntary processes. What we mean by that, so voluntary, things that you are choosing to. So that's really predominantly more like your limbs, okay? So your arms and your legs, you can control, how your neck moves, things like that. All right, involuntary, we'll just think about it from the perspective of the brain. You don't have to tell your brain to then tell the lungs or to tell the heart to work. Okay, that's what we're saying there. With the brain, it helps generate ideas. So ideas are good for making change or to stay in control of oneself. It helps store memories, and then there's that experienced emotional energy. Okay, so with that mind-body connection, what we also want to think about is how does our body guard itself? Okay, the immune system is that guardian, all right, and making sure that things do not become too out of place, too far away from homeostasis or that centered piece that you feel, the grounded piece that you have of your whole system. All right. So for our sake here, what we're talking about is lymphocytes and antibodies. All right. Those are going to be your frontline defense against anything that's really trying to pose a threat to you. And so because those lymphocytes and antibodies are there, they're sent out by the central nervous system to then attack whatever might be causing concern, whether it be an infection, whether it be, free radical cells or anything like that. All right. But understand that can be compromised. Like it says there, stress alters the immune system. So because of that, if we have a compromised immune system, then ultimately what ends up happening is immune function is not working correctly, lymphocytes and antibodies are not sent out accordingly. They're kind of thrown off. And at that point there, you can't fight off infection or disease as rapidly or as well as you once could. All right. So we have to think about that, from that perspective, is that anytime we put that immune system into a compromised manner, we're not going to get the reaction that we need from it. All right. So that's why the mind-body connection is so important. So what happens? Well, ultimately we end up getting stressed. Okay. Well, stress comes in a couple different forms. All right. But the first thing that we want to talk about is what truly is stress. Like it says there, it's mental, emotional, and physiological responses to something that is new, something that is scary, threatening, frightening, exciting. It doesn't have to be bad per se, because if something is new, that's actually could be a good stress. Okay. So what are we talking about? Good and bad stress, positive and negative stress. Eustress is that positive stress. Typically, you're going to find that from stressors that are created from things like working out, from positive health changes, things like that. Distress is the one that we usually consider when we talk about stress and the negative approaches that we have on the body. Usually we talk about distress, which is that negative one. It's the unpleasant or harmful stress, where then you start to have a deterioration of the whole system in general, and then exposes you more to the immune system breaking down, and then you're not fighting off infection or disease as well. All right. And there you go. There's a point in time where you get into this optimal. So again, if we look at our mouse here, optimal performance and well-being is in that high level of eustress, but understand that you hit a certain point. Okay. You hit a certain point where you hit a limitation where you no longer are in a good situation. So as you get to that optimal stress level, if you start going above optimal, you're going to end up in that distress pattern. So someone who looks at exercise, for example, you're looking at this. They start off and they're like the stress for them is low. All right, and as they become more adapted to exercise, they have more eustress. They have this really good feeling and they have a really good well-being. All right, then you hit this optimal performance zone, or the zone, as some people may say. Well, if you go beyond that, meaning if it becomes overly obsessive, where you're no longer able to control it, or you feel as though you had a piece of cake last night and you got to go to the gym right after you had the cake, that no longer is that optimal well-being that you once felt in that zone area. What you then have is an overabundance of high stress that is now consuming you, and that's where it turns into distress. And that's where you can see here that although you're trying to be healthy and be in that zone, you're obsessing over it, and that's where health and performance drops because you're no longer in that correct mental state, meaning that you now are more emotional. The physiological responses are not the same because it's just consuming you and you're doing things way more than you should. Right? That's just an example of how this would work, okay? But the differences between good and bad stress is really what we're looking at there, and how it can transition from being good and in that zone, as you would say, into something that is now a distress and going to be taxing on the body. All right. So again, what are we saying here with stress is, how do we adapt to it? Well, our body's really good at it, but it can only do it for so long before it finally falls apart. And I don't mean like horribly, but there are, it falls apart, meaning it breaks down. All right. So as our body is going through day to day, we're always trying to stay in that homeostasis, like I was saying before, that centered piece, that equilibrium where you're trying to maintain this constant feeling of, as external forces come in, you're trying to balance them internally, all right? And so what ends up happening is you go through what's called the general adaptation syndrome, or gas, okay? So what ends up happening is you have three different phases right here. You have the alarm, the resistance, and the exhaustion, okay? The alarm, the resistance, the exhaustion. So typically what happens in this general adaptation syndrome is you end up with an alarm reaction. So that's basically how you respond to a specific stressor, okay? You respond in a way. At that point, you end up developing a resistance to everything, meaning that you're going to build up this response system, or like it says here, reserves are called upon, where you now are going to try to fight off some stressor that's coming in, okay? What happens is if you are able to get to that point where you're starting to fight things off, you're going to get to that exhaustion and recovery phase where the reserves are drained and then the body, like it says here, is functioning at a diminished capacity. So that's where the exhaustion comes in, where you start to maybe feel fatigued, broken down, just don't feel like yourself like on some days, and that's where that part comes into play. The problem is that when you go into this exhaustion and recovery, what typically happens, and this is where the diagram comes into play, if your exhaustion goes below homeostasis and stays in that area, you'll end up becoming sick, okay? And that's usually a problem that we run into, is that, staying down in that exhaustion phase for too long can become a problem. So what are we looking at? Our body will react. We will have this exhaustion, and then if we can recover from that exhaustion, we go back to homeostasis, which is great. That's what we're really looking for. But it's the minute that exhaustion goes beyond normal barriers that we have the problem that we run into. And that's where exhaustion turns into sickness, illness, disease. Okay? And that's what we're looking at there. So that's your general adaptation syndrome. So compare this slide to the slide that's a few down, and you can see how the alarm puts you below homeostasis. It's like, oh, something just happened. And then you build up these stressors they're building up where you become resistant to it, and you're trying to fight, try to stay, stress is coming in, you're trying to fight against it, and then you get into that point where you're no longer, fighting, it's just you become tired, and you try to get to that point where you're trying to relax and recover, but you usually fall below homeostasis. You get to that point where you feel kind of fatigued and you just feel run down. But if you can recover because you're in a good light, then that's great, and that means that you are going to just keep going and doing what you're supposed to be doing. All right. Whereas if it continues, that's where you get sick. All right. So again, with the alarm, what are we saying here? If we go back to that, that alarm phase, and when we build up, that's where we can get into what we call fight or flight. And that's where what we call the sympathetic nervous system takes over. That's going to come up way more in our exercise physiology class. But understand that the sympathetic nervous system sends out hormonal responses to get the body to react and get excited, all right? Or it gets stressed and it takes a reaction from you, okay? And that's where that first stage of alarm comes into before you get to that resistance phase, okay? And that's really what we're talking about there. So again, this is where, if we look at this image here, if we kind of pull it open a little bit more so you can see it in a little bit, but you have your stressor, how you perceive it. Your brain responds by sending out, the sympathetic nervous system activations, and it'll change everything from, it'll give you anxiety, headaches. You can have high blood pressure at that moment. You might have muscle aches or pains. And then from there, what will happen is you'll have a stress response from the pituitary gland that will then tell your body to react in a certain way. So you might end up with, decreased performance, or you might start to relax and recover. Okay, so it just depends. As long as you can release the stress from your system. All right, so how do we take care of this, exhaustion and recovery? Well, our system with its adaptation has what we call an allostatic load. All right, as our allostatic load increases, that puts more demand on our body, which will then lead to health concerns. Okay, so if we have too much of an allostatic load, that means that we're responding in a negative way. Well, how do we know we're responding that way? Because we can tell by, inflammatory markers inside of our blood. We can see how much cortisol is in our system. We can see if we have, all of a sudden, you're like, oh, I've been getting really stressed lately. What happens? Well, your LDL cholesterols will go up. Right? All of those are part of that stress response, and all of those are part of that, like I said, the exhaustion and recovery. Whereas if it starts, the allostatic load does not diminish, you're going to have more and more concerns. So that's where we're really looking at making sure that we can bite all those things in the butt before we can, get going with, before they take effect and we get going in the wrong direction. So that's really, really important for us to make sure we observe those factors. All right. So, obviously sources of stress, those vary between everybody, but it just depends on, who you are, what you do, what your job is, what your lifestyle is like. Well, if you look here, this is in terms of a college student, if we kind of open that up a little bit, but you can see that there's a lot of factors that come into play. We don't need to go into all of them, but you can see any of these things that come into play are going to cause a stressful environment for a particular person. Now, this is for basically college students, but again, it relates to adulthood as well. All right. Um, so, when we talk about things and how we perceive things, our attitude toward health, we have what's called an explanatory style, which is a way in which people have a tendency to explain a specific event to themselves. Okay. So, for our sake, there's two types: optimistic, all right, and pessimistic. Glass half full, all right, see that you can fight off things. Pessimistic, glass half empty, meaning that you don't think that things are going to change. Okay, depends on you as the person, but those are two explanatory styles that we get more into in the sports psych class. But really understand that there's an optimistic and a pessimistic side to a person, and how do you perceive yourself? How do you live that way? Okay. With stress, self-esteem comes into play. How do you feel about your own worth? It's how you appraise or believe in or test your own feelings about how you are worthy of yourself. Okay? Positive self-esteem usually gives you a better outlook on things. It makes healing easier. You can roll around homeostasis a little bit easier, whereas low, you're going to talk about, again, being a little bit more higher in terms of disease risk. The fighting spirit, you might have heard of this, but really, with the fighting spirit, you might hear people say that, well, I defeated cancer, and they told me I wasn't going to live, 2 days. I'm living now 5 years later, because they have that fighting spirit. They really feel like the more that they put out, the more effort they put out, and stay positive, stay focused, that they can basically defeat all odds, and that's just because of the fact that, the more positivity that you have rolling through your system, the less stress you have, even though your body is under stress, that it might be able to help fight and defend it. Okay. So again, with us, as with stress, how our behaviors affecting us. Well, how are we as people? Are you a type A person, a type B person, or a type C person? Type A being that more ambitious, more hard driven, more like a coach, really hard, really tough. A type B person is a little bit more reserved, a little bit more laid back. Okay, whereas type C is a combination of the two. So where are you? Where do you fall within that mix? And that can really affect you. Obviously a type A person, if they have a hard time controlling that, then what's going to end up happening is that they're going to be more stressed. They might lead to disease or illness on more pronounced levels. All right. So what is it that makes you more vulnerable? Well, there's health. What your overall health is right now, your social support, how you feel about what's your worth, what are you worth to yourself, and then is there any sort of nurturance? Do you have people caring for you and things like that? All right. Are you getting enough sleep? Ultimately what we're saying here is that technically you should have about 7 to 9 hours. Typically the standard is about 8. All right. But look what happens when sleep obviously allows us to recover. It helps us heal. But look what happens when you don't. Immune system weakened. We already talked about that. Mental function, you can't think. You all know that. You wake up and you're just like, oh, in this groggy state. All right. Stress levels, mood, memory, they all get affected in a negative way. All right. So, and then obviously that can start impacting things like, mental disorders and, physiological problems as well. So we got to be aware of that. Sleep is crucial. Okay. We know that college students don't, you all are college students. We know that college students don't get it, especially if you have kids or you have a job or you're doing this or that or the other thing. There's putting more pressure on you. Okay. So we got to be aware of that. And you can't make up sleep. That's one thing. You can't catch up. It's hard to catch up. If you slept 3 hours last night, or just say it's a Friday, and you slept, 3 hours on Thursday into Friday morning. Well, you can't go to sleep on, Friday night at 7 p.m. and sleep until 9 a.m. the next day and think that you're going to feel better. Typically, it doesn't usually help, or it sometimes makes you feel worse. And then what that does is, it drops that immune system functioning, and it doesn't make you feel better physiologically, so it really affects you in more ways than one. All right. So what are some things that we can do? Work on time management. All right. There's different ways that we can affect time management. I can let you all read those, but things like diaries and setting goals, using planners, those all help. All right. But other ways that we can definitely make it better, say no. Sometimes you have to say no because it's only going to help you. All right. Avoid boredom. Set aside overtimes. What we're saying there is that if you know that something is not going to be exactly 2 hours long, make sure that you plan for it. That's what we're saying there. Okay. Understand that things don't always go as planned. All right. And then plan ahead for disruptions is the same way. All right. So the other thing too that I think is becoming a more of a problem is this Technostress era. All right, we're so involved and so tech savvy and so involved in the technological features of everything that it can disrupt our normal day to day. So we have to find a way to say, put it down. Really, that's what it comes down to. Because we have these. The other thing now is we're so tech savvy. We have blurred lines between work and play. We have blurred lines between family and work. Work and free time. So it just everything becomes so blurred and so like one into the same that you start losing out on a lot of things that you normally would get, like concentration, being more focused on relationships, being more active with family and friends, all right, and then just being able to detach and step away. That's really the most important part of this, but it's hard, especially when you have specific jobs or you have certain ways that you have to use technology, all right. So with all that kind of stress, well, what are we doing? How are we coping? Well, everybody has a different way of coping, but it has to be healthy. Okay. If you're starting to see patterns where you're not being yourself or things don't feel the same, then that's where or when you're working with your people, your clients and prospective people, like we have to be able to cope with stress, but we have to find the ways that are healthy for us and not the unhealthy ways like binge drinking or drug use or, switching to like cigarette smoking or whatever it may be, tobacco use of any kind or whatever it may be. So we have to be aware of that. All right. You have to be able to identify things like it says right here, identify and try to agree with your own self to change or remove stress. All right. That's really going to happen because ultimately what's going to happen is if you don't know what the cause is, you can't find a way to fix it. So you have to be able to identify. And then controlling, that's going to be finding ways that you as a person can control it on your own. But really there's ways like it says here, exercise relaxation techniques. That might be where we're looking into meditation or deep breathing or guided imagery or anything along those lines where we're looking into finding ways to cope with that stress so we can get into that recovery phase versus staying in that exhaustion phase, like we said in that general adaptation syndrome. All right. And then obviously we try to decrease muscular tension. So what we're trying to do is stay loose, use things like aerobic exercise, flexibility, working out, going for walks. It doesn't matter what it is, but try to avoid that stressor, all right? All right, and then actually at that point too, we end up with an endorphin release, which makes us feel better, which will then help us to control our stress more likely than not, So, the other thing too is, with physical activity, what are we doing? Well, we know that, team sports can be really good. It doesn't matter if it's a men's night at a local bar where you have billiards. It doesn't matter if it's a female bowling league. It doesn't matter if it's, a basketball league, a softball league, a volleyball league. All of those things will really come into play with team sports because you also have the social component, not just for yourself. All right. And it gives you a challenge because you're actually competing, even though it's only on like an amateur or below level where, we're doing it for the fun of it more so than we're doing it for getting paid $0, because we're not elite athletes at that point. All right. But again, it's a good way for stress relief. Yoga has many different ways of, there's many different kinds and ways of yoga. Find one that might be right, and that might work for you because not only are you working on strength, you do get some strength in there. Not only are you working on flexibility, but you're also working on that mind-body connection, which we talked about earlier. All right, Tai Chi or Qigong is another method. They're very similar in approaches, but again, it's a way for guided approaches to breathing and going through motions so that you feel that you're becoming more at peace with not only the world, but within your internal self. Okay, those are ways that we can work on that. Um, so the other thing is when we talk about with relaxation techniques, there's also something called biofeedback where we're taking in specific stimuli and we're reevaluating it within our system so that then we can have a proper response for what's being broken. All right. So one of the things that we do in the sports psych class is for each class, we do a morning biofeedback session where we do 6 different things like blinking rate, we do heart rate, blood pressure, we do a hand grip squeeze to see what's happening there. You do a reaction drill test, and then those components are put together to show you, if you're comparing day to day, well, I feel stressed today. Well, look at your scores to see what they're like for days that you were doing very well. And that biofeedback will say, you know what, maybe I need to make sure that I make a couple of changes in my day so I don't over stress myself. And at that point there, from those responses, you know how to adjust day to day. Right? Biofeedback is very, very important. You have to be able to, again, thinking about it, you're listening to your body. You're getting these bits and pieces of information coming into your system that I don't feel as great as I do on previous days, so I have to change that. Okay. So again, this is basically, so you have a stressor to that person. What's going to happen is there's this biological response that's detected, it's processed, and it gives you feedback so that every time that stressor comes in, you can adjust accordingly or do things differently so that the stressor doesn't come back. All right, that's one of the cool things about this whole cycle. We talked a little bit, it came up a little bit earlier, but progressive muscle relaxation. That's like where lying face up on the floor with a pillow under your knees. Sometimes you might see people do it where they put their feet up on like a lower couch. And what you're doing there is you're working on contracting and relaxing muscles. Sometimes you might have like a recording going on and it might say, okay, now, squeeze your calves and feel that tension, and it might give you directives and everything like that. But what you're doing is you're basically creating tension to then release it, and then that will make that muscle group feel more relaxed. Okay. Really, it's a really interesting thing because what you're doing is you're contracting for about 5 seconds and releasing. So you're tensing and relaxing, but because it's short term, it's actually helping you to de-stress more than anything else. So breathing techniques, deep breathing, sighing actually is an important thing that you should be doing. Exhaling and doing it on a regular basis. It actually helps to bring the heart rate down and kind of calm blood pressure, right? But there's different methods of breathing that you can work with, and it really does help to, in the moment and then over the long term, help you to disengage and de-stress. Talked about visual imagery, but what you're doing is you're basically creating these images in your head that will show you doing things and experiencing things, but you're doing them in the best way possible in the correct forms. And it's really taking that positivity and moving around through it where you're in that moment. And by that, what it does is it diminishes that stress response that you have in the system and ultimately helps you to relax and bring some stress down. But it really makes you feel better about yourself and what your ability level is. Okay. Autogenic training is more about kind of getting yourself into more of like a hypnotic state. And then you're working on, like, that's the one where sometimes you might see people, they sit up nice and straight in a chair. They have their arms placed out in front of them on their thighs, and they're just sitting there nice and tall. And what they're doing is they're working on that, like, now feel the energy rolling from your feet up through your legs. And what you're doing is you're trying to just calm those systems down, feel that heaviness, feel that warmth. And what it does is it develops all the way from feet to head, and you start feeling that like de-stressed moment, right? But it's a really, really cool thing. Now, you're not going to be in hypnosis, but what you're doing is you're basically taking the body and the brain and just kind of releasing it so that it can feel everything else besides anything else going on in your brain. Meditation, we've worked, many people have used meditation for many, many years about, just constantly thinking about, they're feeling their breathing, they're listening to sounds, they're in a good posture, they're seeing things that they may have never seen before, they're moving in a slow manner, and all of those things equate to just the calming effect of the surroundings. So finding a quiet place and not in an environment that's going to stimulate, stress again. So that's meditation to a T. Um, Observe, accept, and let go. I mean, that's a really cool thing where you can you see things and you're accepting of them. You're seeing it for its natural beauty potentially. And then what you're doing is you're releasing from the real world that you're living in to let go of that stress and all that tension and whatever other emotions you might be feeling. Okay. Um, and that really helps. And then the other thing with, meditation too is what we would, when we talk about mindfulness, and that's another part of, and that's just being involved in the moment and seeing everything that's around you. Okay, by being in that moment, what it means is that you're embracing the things that you don't necessarily always see, but you're also engaged in your environment so that you can respond effectively and accordingly to that moment. So um, just respond because you want to, and that really does help. But mindfulness is really important because it keeps you in the moment, and then you become more rightfully observant of everything that happens. So again, I've said it throughout this lecture here, but everybody develops a way to deal with stress differently. So really what it's all about is for you, for your people that you might be working with in the future, it's about what's going to work best for them. So trying a lot of these things, yoga might not work for somebody, Tai Chi might, mindfulness approaches where you're just being in the moment might work for somebody, deep breathing might not, so we just have to find the best thing for everybody, because coping with daily stress that everybody has is vital to be especially in this time and era where things are just so wildly out of control that you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. So that's chapter 10. That's stress assessment, being able to detect and then make those changes. But like I said, we're going to get way more involved in this when we get into our psychology course, so that more of these things spit out and they are um, more in your face and more detailed, so that we get a better understanding as to how we can use it in a, especially with an exercise and a fitness perspective or even sport perspective. So that's chapter 10 again, and I hope to hear from everybody soon. Take care.